I never set out to become the most hated man on the Homeowners Association's mailing list, and I definitely never imagined I'd own a hotel, especially one bolted together overnight like a dare, squatting on land the HOA swore belonged to them. But the morning they taped that bright orange violation notice to my door, threatening $500 daily fines unless I removed all unauthorized structures, something inside me snapped. Picture a pristine suburb where every blade of grass leans at the same angle, where garden gnomes are contraband, and where the HOA board struts around like mini monarchs. I used to laugh at their petty rules, until they aimed their laser pointer of authority at me. According to their brand new survey, the modest guest house my late father and I built a decade ago trespassed 18 inches onto common space. 18 inches! For that sliver of dirt, they demanded demolition, daily fines, and a written apology signed in triplicate. I spent a sleepless night pacing the floorboards Dad and I had laid, replaying his words about bullies only winning when you offer your lunch money. By dawn, a wicked idea bloomed. If they insisted the land was theirs, I'd use every square inch of it, louder, brighter, and more profitably than they could ever imagine. Let them try to fine me for creativity. So while the HOA drafted threats, I drafted blueprints. Not for a meek shed or a legal appeal, no. For a pop-up micro-hotel with 2 cedar-clad suites, solar panels, and a neon vacancy sign aimed straight at their manicured sensibilities. If they wanted a fight over 18 inches, I would give them 20 feet of unfiltered audacity. That was the spark, the moment suburban quiet ignited into open war. And by the time the first guests checked in, the HOA realized their tidy rulebook hadn't prepared them for a neighbor like me. Before all this began, life in Sycamore Grove was comfortable, predictable even, the kind of neighborhood where garbage bins walked themselves to the curb at 7 a.m. every Tuesday and porch lights flicked off like synchronized swimmers at precisely 10. It wasn't exciting, but it was peaceful. I had moved in 8 years earlier, drawn in by the tree-lined streets and the illusion of permanence. After years of drifting between apartments, the 3-bedroom house with the wraparound porch felt like home. I could finally breathe. I built garden beds along the back fence, planted an apple tree, and strung up lights that glowed like fireflies at night. It was simple, quiet, mine. When my dad got sick, I built a small guest house behind the main house so he could live nearby without being confined to a sterile room. We built it together in the early days of his illness. I handled the heavy lifting. He did the measuring, the planning, the dad things. It wasn't fancy, just a studio with a little kitchenette and a bathroom, but it was his and he loved it. After he passed, I couldn't bring myself to tear it down. I kept it clean, maintained the structure, even replaced the siding one summer. It stood like a monument to all the things we'd built. Family, memory, peace. The HOA never said a word. Not one complaint. Not a single letter. For nearly a decade, the guest house existed in silence, tucked behind the hedges, hidden from the road and mostly ignored by the neighbors. I thought I had done everything right. Followed the rules, paid my dues, waved politely at board members as they power-walked past. But peace, I would learn, is often just the calm before the enforcement storm. And in Sycamore Grove, that storm wore khakis and carried clipboards. It was a Tuesday morning, warm and forgettable, until I opened the mailbox and saw it. A stark white envelope with the HOA's crimson logo pressed into the top left corner like a wax seal. Inside was a notice so absurd, so aggressive, I had to read it twice just to believe it was real. Violation notice. Unauthorized structure and encroachment on HOA common property. Daily fines of $500 to begin in 72 hours. I stared at the words, numb at first, then rapidly boiling. They weren't just claiming the guest house was in violation. They were alleging that part of it extended onto HOA-owned common space. I'd heard of people getting fined for paint colors or mailbox styles, but this was war over 18 inches of earth, most of it covered by mulch and weeds. The letter accused me of using the guest house for unauthorized occupancy and stated that unless it was dismantled or relocated within 3 days, penalties would apply, retroactively, if necessary. The tone was smug, final, bureaucratic. There was no invitation to discuss or appeal, just an iron gavel of suburban power coming down on my home like a guillotine. I flipped the page. Attached was a low-resolution aerial survey, highlighted in red and yellow, with a crooked line slicing just past the guesthouse wall. It looked like something a drunk intern drafted on a lunch break. Still, that was their evidence. The letter closed with a signature. Geraldine Lawton, President, Sycamore Grove HOA. A name I barely recognized but would come to know far too well. I reread the notice 3 more times, each pass building pressure behind my temples. I wasn't just shocked. I was insulted. After 8 years of quiet compliance, they were declaring me an enemy of the neighborhood over a few feet of disputed soil. I didn't sleep that night. My thoughts pinballed between disbelief and fury. How could something as stable as a decade-old structure suddenly become illegal? I'd pulled permits when we built it. I even remembered standing in the backyard with the inspector, drinking lukewarm coffee while he complimented my framing work. At dawn, I was out there with a measuring tape, half-dressed and still barefoot, trying to make sense of the so-called encroachment. From my fence line to the back edge of the guest house, it measured just under 5 feet, well within my property, or so I'd always believed. But property lines are tricky, especially when you're dealing with communal landscaping and vague plat maps. I dug through every folder I had: permits, tax documents, the original plot survey from when I bought the house. Nothing said anything about a conflict. No warnings. No boundary disputes. Just quiet approval. It wasn't until I visited the county records office that I got the full picture. Apparently, Geraldine, our freshly elected HOA president, had commissioned an updated survey of all property boundaries the month after she took over. According to her new lines, my guest house was now trespassing. It's not uncommon for HOAs to commission new surveys, the clerk said, barely looking up from her monitor, especially if they're looking to rezone or develop parts of common space. Rezone? Develop? That's when something clicked. This wasn't about my guest house. This was about the land. The HOA wanted to do something with that strip behind the houses, and my structure was suddenly inconvenient. I clenched my fists as the reality sank in. They didn't care about rules. They cared about control. They wanted me to fold, to tear down something sacred because it blocked their path to profit. But if they expected me to roll over, they were about to meet a very different kind of neighbor. A few days later, while I was nursing a bitter cup of coffee and watching the sunrise over what was apparently their land now, my neighbor Dale wandered over. Dale was the kind of guy who always knew things he wasn't supposed to. Retired contractor, local poker legend, and the closest thing our neighborhood had to an underground informant. He looked around casually before speaking. "You heard what Geraldine's trying to do, right?" I shook my head, still reeling from the fine notice. "All I know is they want my guest house gone." Dale sighed. "She's planning a new community wellness center back there. Fitness classes, yoga, maybe a juice bar. HOA board approved the preliminary plans 2 weeks ago. Quietly. Your place is in the way." My stomach turned. So it was about development. This wasn't enforcement, it was eviction by manipulation. I asked, "Why not just ask me to move it or negotiate something?" He smirked. "Because if you agree, it's clean. If you fight, she gets to make an example of you." That's when it all came together. This wasn't personal. Not at first. It was strategic. Geraldine wanted to turn Sycamore Grove into her legacy project, a shining model of HOA-run urban living. That meant polished trails, spa centers, and no trace of anything unapproved. My guest house didn't fit her aesthetic or her budget timeline. I looked back at the guest house. It wasn't flashy, but it had meaning. It held my history, my dad's memory, and 10 years of quiet life. She wanted it gone for the sake of a smoothie bar. Could have sold the house. Could have moved. But something about the smugness of it all, the calculated way they were trying to erase me, it made my blood boil. They wanted a war of attrition. But I don't do attrition. I do escalation. That night, as I sat on the porch staring at the guest house bathed in soft porch light, a question kept looping through my mind. What would piss them off more than just keeping it standing? And then, somewhere between rage and stubborn creativity, an idea flickered to life. If they claimed I was using the structure commercially, which I wasn't, what if I leaned into it? What if I actually used it commercially? Let them try to fine me for something I was already being punished for. I pulled out my laptop, opened the county zoning portal, and started digging. Hours passed. Legalese blurred into one another, but finally, I stumbled onto a strange clause in the municipal code. Temporary movable dwellings, such as trailers or modular tiny homes, were not subject to certain HOA restrictions if they remained on wheels and complied with utility standards. That's when the idea truly ignited. I wouldn't just keep the guest house. I'd expand it with something they couldn't touch. A rolling, legal, temporary hospitality unit that followed the city's guidelines but sat on the very strip of land Geraldine claimed was hers. A hotel. Tiny hotel. Right in the HOA's lap. At first, I laughed it off as impossible. But the longer I sat there, the more it made sense. I had tools, time, and just enough construction experience to pull it off. If they were going to call me a violator, I'd become one with receipts. I'd monetize the war. By sunrise, I had already mapped out the dimensions for 2 units. Compact, stylish, mobile, solar-powered, composting toilets, off-grid chic. If Geraldine wanted a spectacle, I'd give her one. Not a fight in court. A fight in headlines. Let her explain that to the board. Why yes, Geraldine. That is a hotel on HOA land. Would you like to book a room? The next day, I put in a call to an old friend, Ravi, a tiny home builder I'd met at a sustainability expo a few years back. I explained what I wanted in as few words as possible. 2 mobile structures, solar panels, smart locks, composting systems, and a design that screamed boutique luxury but whispered legal compliance. Ravi didn't even pause. You're building a hotel to piss off an HOA? He asked. I told him yes. He laughed for 30 seconds straight. I'm in, he said. We called in favors. Found discounted materials. Even used some reclaimed wood from a barn Ravi had salvaged in Vermont. I cleared the back lot, laid a gravel base for the wheels, and prepped the hookups. Since the units weren't technically permanent structures, I didn't need foundation permits or HOA approval. Every night I worked until my hands were numb. I insulated walls, framed windows, installed shelving and lighting. The design was tight, efficient, Scandinavian style with cedar siding and a matte black trim. It looked like something you'd find on a minimalist travel blog, not behind a suburban fence. Neighbors began to notice, of course. A few waved. Some stared. But no one complained, at least not to my face. By the 3rd week, the 2 units were complete. I rolled them into place under cover of darkness, just in case. Hooked up power, tested the waterless toilets, ran diagnostics on the solar panels. Everything worked. And then I took the final step. I made a listing on a boutique travel site. Called it the Boundary Inn. Posted photos of the interiors. Sleek design, vintage record player, bookshelves full of old travel journals, and a handmade sign on the door that read, "Check in. Chill out." The first reservation came in 12 hours later. War, as it turned out, had an occupancy rate. It was a Friday morning when the first guests arrived. A young couple from Portland, traveling cross-country and looking for quirky, hidden gems to stay in. I watched them step out of their electric SUV, all wide eyes and camera gear, completely unaware they were about to become part of a suburban standoff. They loved it. The tiny hotel units, the handwritten welcome notes, the curated vinyl records. It was everything they'd hoped for. Feels like we're camping in luxury, the guy said as he snapped a photo for their travel blog. They didn't ask why the host seemed tense. They didn't need to. Across the street, Geraldine stood frozen on her front porch, latte in hand, robe flapping in the wind like a battle flag. Her eyes locked on the guests wheeling their suitcases through my side gate. I waved at her. She didn't wave back. By that afternoon, the listing had already gained traction. A few more bookings trickled in. People messaged me saying they loved the idea of a micro-hotel hidden inside suburbia. The irony wasn't lost on me. And then came the knock. 3 board members, Geraldine in front, flanked by 2 HOA loyalists, stood at my door, fists full of papers and fury. "You're running a commercial enterprise on HOA property," she hissed. "This is a violation of—" "Nope," I interrupted. That land hasn't been maintained by the HOA for over a decade. You never mowed it, never landscaped it. I've got dated photos, witness statements, and a surveyor's note confirming it's in legal limbo. And the units, I smiled. They're mobile, legally classified as temporary dwellings, outside your jurisdiction. She looked like she'd swallowed her own gavel. For the first time, Geraldine didn't have a retort, just silence. That silence tasted sweeter than any victory I'd imagined. The cease and desist letter came the very next morning, slipped under my door like a threat wrapped in stationery. Printed in bold at the top, cease all commercial activity immediately or face legal action. Beneath it, a parade of HOA regulations, cherry-picked and stitched together to look official. I read it once, then again, then I laughed. By the time I'd finished my coffee, I had my response ready, neatly typed, dated, and stapled to a copy of the county's zoning exemption for movable units. I included screenshots of the hotel listing, my municipal lodging permit, and, my personal favorite, a certified land use survey showing the encroached section of land was, in fact, unclaimed and unmaintained. Legally, they had no leg to stand on. I dropped my letter into Geraldine's mailbox like a lit fuse. The next few days were pure theater. Board members paced in front of my property, pretending to assess boundaries with clipboards and yardsticks. Geraldine started parking her car across the street, sitting in it like a hawk on stakeout. Guests came and went, oblivious to the cold stares and whispered phone calls. I set up a chalkboard sign at the driveway. Welcome to the boundary in where the HOA ends and freedom begins. That's when things really blew up. A local blogger caught wind of the story. Man builds hotel on HOA land to spite petty fines, the headline screamed. Within 48 hours, my booking calendar was full for the next 2 months. A film student emailed asking if she could do a short documentary. I hadn't just won a round. I'd turned their little war into a spectacle. And Geraldine? She couldn't figure out if she was being mocked, outmaneuvered, or both. In truth, it was all three. And the best part? I was just getting started. By the end of the week, I received an official summons. Geraldine and the HOA had filed a lawsuit, civil trespass, commercial misuse of common property, and a dozen other charges stitched together by their HOA-approved attorney like some Frankenstein of municipal overreach. But I was ready. I had already retained my own lawyer, Mia Tran, a brilliant zoning attorney with a spine of titanium and a sense of humor sharp enough to cut drywall. She read through the complaint with an arched brow and a slight smirk. They're throwing spaghetti at the wall and hoping something sticks, she said. Unfortunately for them, you've already sealed most of the cracks. Mia filed a countersuit. She brought up adverse possession, how I had maintained that strip of land for over a decade while the HOA did nothing. She submitted time-stamped photos, neighborhood witness statements, landscaping receipts. We weren't just going to block their suit, we were going to turn it inside out. The court date was set for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, Geraldine stepped up her campaign. Flyers appeared in mailboxes warning of unauthorized businesses threatening neighborhood values. Someone spray-painted "Sell out" on my trash bin. A few neighbors stopped waving, but many others started knocking. People I barely knew dropped by to say they were on my side. Some brought baked goods. Others offered legal advice, copies of past HOA minutes, emails from Geraldine filled with veiled threats. Turns out I wasn't the only one who'd been targeted over the years. I was just the first to fight back with an Airbnb listing and an attitude. And in the middle of all that chaos, the boundary inn remained fully booked. The HOA had declared war, but they'd underestimated one thing. I wasn't just defending myself. I was building a case brick by brick, and business was booming. The courthouse smelled like paper and panic. Geraldine walked in wearing a blazer 3 sizes too stiff and a scowl sharp enough to file legal briefs. Her lawyer shuffled behind her with an armful of binders, none of which would save them. Mia stood beside me, cool and unbothered. They're going to try to make this about community values, she whispered. But we'll keep it about facts, law, and dirt. Specifically, the dirt you've cared for over 10 years. The proceedings started slow. Geraldine's attorney read off violations with theatrical flair, like this was an audition for courtroom TV. He painted me as a rogue entrepreneur threatening the moral fabric of Sycamore Grove, somehow conflating my hotel with lawlessness, urban decay, and maybe even Satan. Then Mia stood up and unraveled them. She began with the timeline. A decade of undisputed maintenance, improvements, mowing, even tax records showing my upkeep of the disputed area. Then came the land survey. It clearly showed that the HOA had never marked or maintained the property, effectively abandoning it. Mia cited the state's adverse possession laws, showing how I had met the requirement of open, continuous, and hostile use without interruption. Their argument crumbled fast. When it was my turn, I kept it simple. I built a guest house with my father. When he died, I kept it up. The HOA never said a word until it got in the way of their development project. The judge didn't rule right then, but we could read his face. 3 days later, the judgment landed. The land in question had never been properly established or enforced by the HOA. The structures must eventually be removed due to zoning, but I had every right to continue occupying it temporarily. It wasn't total victory, but it was enough, and I was going to make the most of it. The judgment hit the neighborhood like a lightning bolt. Geraldine's empire cracked at the foundation. She couldn't evict me. She couldn't fine me. And worst of all, for her, she couldn't stop me from running the hotel, for now. I had 90 days before the zoning clause required me to remove the temporary structures. 90 days. That was 3 full months of legal operation. 3 months to let the story spread, to turn my rebellious inn into a legend. I doubled down. The boundary inn became a symbol overnight. I added a second listing on another travel site, this time marketing it as a resistance retreat with a nod and wink description. Perfect for those escaping micromanagement and beige rulebooks. Bloggers ate it up. Travel influencers posted glowing reviews about their 5-star stay in a 4-foot rebellion. One guest painted a mural on the back of the unit, a phoenix rising over a scroll of HOA citations. The bookings went through the roof. Meanwhile, the HOA fell into chaos. Geraldine called an emergency meeting to restore order. Only half the board showed up. 2 members resigned publicly. A third was caught forwarding internal emails to a local reporter. The control she'd wielded so easily weeks before now slipped through her fingers like sand. And me? I was profitable. Very profitable. The boundary inn brought in enough in those 90 days to cover the fine they tried to stick me with. 10 times over. I took the extra cash and reinvested it. Into my garden, my house, my peace. On the final day of my court-approved timeline, I towed the hotel units out with a rented truck, waving to a small group of neighbors who had come to watch. Some clapped. One offered champagne. I didn't just win a battle. I built something stronger: respect, autonomy, and a legend. Once the units were gone, Geraldine thought the storm had passed. She assumed removing the hotel meant restoring her grip on Sycamore Grove. But she didn't understand what had really changed. It wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about the neighborhood. People had seen behind the curtain. They'd watched the HOA weaponize rules, manipulate surveys, and try to steamroll someone for not fitting into their mold. And they'd seen someone fight back and win without folding, without fear. That did something to people. One by one, neighbors started speaking up. Sarah from 2 houses down demanded an audit of HOA spending. Greg, who'd once been fined for planting unauthorized succulents, showed up to meetings with a stack of bylaws and a sharper tongue than anyone expected. Even the quiet couple on the corner circulated a petition demanding a vote to recall the entire board. I stayed mostly quiet during this part. The last thing I wanted was to become the face of a movement I hadn't asked for. But it was happening whether I let it or not. By the end of the month, Geraldine's support base was gone. The people who once nodded at her every word now sat on their hands, looked at their feet, or simply stopped showing up. She tried to push new rules, but no one seconded her motions. She tried to accuse others of misconduct, but the room just stared back, unmoved. The final straw came at the quarterly HOA meeting. Someone stood up, quiet, soft-spoken Maria from Birch Lane, and asked, "Can we vote on new leadership?" The room erupted into applause. Geraldine didn't answer. She gathered her papers, stood, and walked out. Just like that, the crown slipped from her head. The HOA hadn't been defeated in court. It had been abandoned by its own people. Life after the war was quieter. Not the kind of quiet that comes from suppression or rules. The real kind. The kind that settles in after a storm. When the air feels clean and everyone breathes easier. Geraldine didn't return to the board. She didn't return to much of anything. A month after the leadership vote, a for sale sign appeared on her perfectly trimmed lawn, and within 6 weeks, her house was empty. No goodbye, no statement, just silence. The new HOA board was made up of neighbors I actually knew: Maria, Greg, even Dale. People who understood that power wasn't about control. It was about stewardship. They didn't dismantle the HOA entirely, but they gutted the nonsense. Out went the obscure clauses and secret votes. In came transparency, empathy, and some damn common sense. The area behind my house, the one we fought over, was turned into a community garden. A real one. Everyone pitched in. We planted tomatoes, squash, lavender. Someone donated benches. Kids started riding bikes back there again. For the first time since I'd moved in, the land wasn't a battleground. It was shared space. It belonged to all of us. As for me, I never rebuilt the hotel. Could've. God knows I had the demand. But it had served its purpose. The boundary in wasn't about profit, it was about principle. And making a point. Once that point had been made, I let it rest. Instead, I expanded my garden. Replanted the fruit trees Dad and I used to sit under. Built a small gazebo where the inn had stood. Sometimes I'd sit there with coffee and just watch the neighborhood come back to life. People stopped by more often. Not out of curiosity, but connection. We swapped produce, helped with repairs, shared stories. The fences felt lower, even if they hadn't changed in height. One afternoon, Tom, who had once been fined for having a wind chime deemed audibly disruptive, asked me what I'd learned from it all. I thought about it. About the fight, the sleepless nights, the hotel bookings, the courtroom tension. About Dad. About Geraldine. About the difference between obedience and peace. Finally, I said, you can't protect something by hiding it. You protect it by standing up for it. Even if your knees shake. He nodded slowly, then laughed. And sometimes by building a hotel on a patch of disputed dirt. We both laughed. The thing is, they tried to crush me with fines, rules, and bureaucracy. They thought I'd cave. Instead, I created something. I pushed back, not with destruction, but with design. I took their threat and turned it into an invitation. And in doing so, I reminded an entire community of what it means to belong, not just obey. I didn't just protect my property. I helped my neighborhood remember what it felt like to be free. And that was worth every single nail, screw, and sleepless night.